December of 2016. A man walks into the health unit at the American Embassy in Havana and tells the doctors something is badly wrong with him. His head is pounding, his stomach is in knots, the floor seems to tilt when he stands up. He hasn't eaten anything strange, he doesn't have a fever, and yet something behind his eyes feels bruised, as though he's taken a blow he never actually felt land. Within days, 2 of his colleagues come forward with almost the same story. Headaches that won't lift, a nausea that comes in waves, a pressure behind the eyes, the kind you get when a plane drops altitude too fast, except none of them have been flying anywhere. And each of them mentions, almost sheepishly, that right before it started they heard something, a sound, thin and high, pressing in from every direction at once. One man says it felt aimed at him, like a beam pointed straight through the wall into his bedroom. Another says it reminded him of marbles tipped into a funnel, spinning and rattling their way down over and over until his head felt the same way. It could have ended there, a handful of strange complaints easy enough to write off, but the cases kept coming. By the end of the following year, 26 American personnel and their family members had reported symptoms, alongside 14 Canadian diplomats living in the same city. Headaches that lasted weeks, ringing in the ears that never faded, hearing loss in some cases, nosebleeds with no warning, a fog that settled over people's minds and made it hard to concentrate, to remember things, to do jobs they'd spent years training for. Dizziness on standing, as if something deep in the ear had been knocked loose and never quite found its way back, and running through nearly every account, that same sound, thin, high, aimed. To understand why this set off such alarm in Washington, you have to understand what Havana meant at that exact moment. For more than 50 years, the United States and Cuba had barely spoken. Diplomatic ties were cut in 1961, not long after Castro's revolution put a communist government in power 90 miles from Florida, and for decades American interests on the island were run out of a small office that functioned like an embassy in everything but name. Then in 2015 that changed, after quiet talks brokered with help from the Vatican and the Canadian government. President Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro announced the restoration of full diplomatic relations. The American flag went up over Havana for the first time in over half a century, held up as one of the defining moments of Obama's presidency, a genuine thaw in one of the longest freezes of the Cold War. So when, barely a year later, American diplomats in that very building started falling ill from something nobody could see, it landed hard. Was this an attack? A warning? An attempt to wreck the new relationship before it had time to take root? Inside the State Department and the CIA, the early theories all pointed the same way. Something deliberate, something hostile, aimed squarely at the people in that embassy. By October of 2017, the United States acted. 60% of its diplomatic staff were pulled out of Cuba. 15 Cuban diplomats were sent home from Washington in return. Travel warnings went out, and tourism to the island, which had been climbing steadily since the thaw, dropped almost overnight. A relationship that had taken decades to rebuild was thrown back into the freezer over headaches, dizziness, and a sound nobody could explain. Doctors at the University of Pennsylvania examined a group of the Havana patients and found something that didn't sit right. The symptoms looked like concussion, balance problems, trouble concentrating, vision disturbances, the kind of thing you'd expect after a hard knock to the head in a car crash or on a football field. But when the doctors went looking for what a concussion leaves behind, the swelling, the bruising, the structural damage on a scan, they found nothing. These people had all the symptoms of a brain injury and none of the proof that one had happened. The first place suspicion landed, naturally, was Havana itself. If something was happening inside diplomatic housing on Cuban soil, who else had the access, the history, the motive? Cuban intelligence had a long-standing reputation for keeping close tabs on foreign diplomats, and the two countries had been at odds for generations. On paper, it looked like the obvious answer. Except Cuba denied it, at length and immediately, and offered full cooperation with whatever investigation Washington wanted. And here's the strange part: a lot of American investigators believed them. Havana had just spent years carefully rebuilding a relationship that brought it real economic benefit. Sabotaging it with a mystery illness aimed at the very diplomats who represented that new relationship made very little sense. And if Cuba wanted to send a message, there were far easier and far less risky ways to do it. The Cuban government even let the FBI send agents onto the island to investigate directly, something that for that relationship was close to unthinkable. So if it wasn't the Cubans, what was it? This is where the recordings come in. Audio of the strange sounds some of the victims had heard eventually reached scientists outside the government, and two researchers who studied it landed on a conclusion that at first sounded almost like a joke. They believed the sound wasn't a weapon at all. They believed it was crickets. A particular species found on the island produces an extraordinarily loud, relentless, high-pitched call. One of the researchers, Alexander Stubbs from the University of California, Berkeley, pointed out just how loud these insects can get, loud enough to be heard from inside a car to in 40 miles an hour on a highway. To someone unfamiliar with the sound, especially someone already living under the low hum of constant surveillance and suspicion, a wall of cricket song pouring through an open window at 2 in the morning might not register as nature at all. It might sound like something pointed at you. But the cricket theory had an obvious hole. Crickets outside a window might ruin your sleep. They don't cause concussion-like symptoms, hearing loss, or nosebleeds. Even the scientists who identified the recordings made that point themselves. At best, the crickets explained what some people heard. They explained nothing about what people felt, which opened the door to a theory with no weapon, no incept, and no foreign government in it at all. Maybe this was about psychology rather than physics. Living and working in Havana came with a particular kind of weight. Diplomats posted there were told as a matter of routine that their homes were probably bugged, their calls probably monitored, and that someone somewhere was probably watching. A former embassy official once described it as a high-threat, high-stress post, the kind of place where people are trained almost from day one to read unusual events as something more than coincidence. In that environment, the theory goes, it wouldn't take much: an unfamiliar noise, a build-up of stress, the sleepless nights that come with feeling watched, to produce headaches and dizziness that felt like something far more sinister than they were. And there's also a well-documented effect where symptoms reported by one person in a tight community spread to others, not because anything physical has happened, but because of shared fear. If the person down the corridor reports a strange noise, followed by a splitting headache, and a week later your own head starts pounding, it's only human to wonder if the same thing has happened to you. Some of the experts who looked into these cases came to believe something like this, sometimes called a mass psychogenic response, accounted for at least part of what was being reported. It's a reasonable theory. It fits a lot of what's known. There's just one problem with using it to explain the whole thing. It doesn't explain China. In May of 2018, an American government employee at the consulate in Guangzhou began experiencing symptoms that sounded eerily familiar: headaches, trouble concentrating, the same general shape as Havana. He was evacuated for medical evaluation, and once word got around, others at the consulate started reporting the same thing. By the end, 15 Americans connected to that consulate were sent home. That was a serious problem for anyone hoping to chalk the whole thing up to stress, or crickets, or the particular pressures of one unusual posting. Guangzhou is a different country, a different climate, a security environment entirely different. If this was purely psychological, why would it strike with the same pattern somewhere with none of the same conditions? And if it was an attack, who was behind it now? Cuba and China occupy very different positions in Washington's world. The idea that the same illness, with the same broad symptoms, was now turning up on two continents made the whole affair feel less like an isolated incident and more like something with a much longer reach. By this point, the case had a name, anomalous health incidents, and a growing file. Panel after panel of scientists and intelligence analysts were brought in to dig through it. One of the earliest reviews came from Jason, a quiet, long-running group of scientists who've advised the government on technical questions too sensitive for ordinary academic review for decades. Their early read leaned away from the idea of a sound-based weapon. Sound waves powerful enough to cause the kind of injuries being described would also be loud enough to record clearly, and would struggle to explain why two people sitting feet apart in the same room weren't affected the same way. The review that mattered most came in 2020 from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, a body that carries as much weight as American science gets on a contested question.
Looking at the pattern, the sudden onset, the link to specific rooms and buildings, the strange directional quality some people described, the panel concluded that the most plausible explanation of everything on the table was exposure to pulsed radio frequency energy, microwaves in plain terms. It wasn't a new idea pulled from nowhere. There's a strange little-known effect where pulsed microwave radiation aimed at someone's head can make them perceive a sound, a click, a buzz, a tone, even though nothing has actually travelled through the air to reach their ears. It's been studied in a limited way since the 1960s. And there's history here, in the very city this story keeps circling back to. During the Cold War, American diplomats in Moscow discovered their embassy was being bathed in low-level microwave radiation, something staff came to call the Moscow signal. Nobody ever fully nailed down why, maybe an attempt to trigger hidden listening devices, maybe interference with the embassy's own equipment, but it proved something important. At least one Cold War rival was willing to point invisible energy at American buildings for reasons Washington never fully worked out, even decades later. If a tightly focused pulse of radio frequency energy could be aimed at a target with precision, the report suggested, it could account for both the sound and the symptoms without leaving behind the kind of evidence a conventional weapon would. No shattered glass, no scorch marks, no device left lying around. An attack that left no fingerprints at all. Among the people who lived through this, one name kept surfacing more than most. Mark Polymeropoulos had spent decades as a senior CIA officer, the kind of career built on postings most people never hear about. In late 2017, on a trip to Moscow, he woke in the night with a vertigo so violent it could barely stand, followed by a headache unlike anything he'd had before. He'd assumed it was a migraine, or exhaustion, or both. It wasn't until he heard other officers describing almost identical episodes in almost identical language that he started to wonder if what had happened to him in that hotel room had a name at all. The migraines never fully went away, neither did the balance problems. Eventually, they ended a career he'd given his whole adult life to. Stories like his are part of why, in 2021, Congress passed what became known as the Havana Act, creating a path for the government to compensate current and former personnel who'd suffered qualifying brain injuries from these incidents, wherever in the world they'd happened. It was, in his own quiet way, an admission. Something real had happened to these people. The cause might still be unresolved, but the damage wasn't up for debate. And yet the wider picture only got murkier from there. In 2022, the CIA and other agencies released the findings of a sweeping review into incidents reported by personnel worldwide, and the conclusion satisfied almost nobody. Most individual cases, looked at closely, could likely be explained by things that had nothing to do with a foreign weapon: undiagnosed conditions, environmental factors tied to specific postings, and in some cases, stress, exactly as the psychological theories had argued all along. There was no evidence, the review found, of any coordinated worldwide campaign by a hostile power using a directed energy weapon. A further assessment the following year landed in much the same place. But buried in that same assessment was a detail that kept the door open. A small number of cases, somewhere around 2 in every 100, simply didn't fit any of the ordinary explanations. Not proven as an attack, never closed off either. Cases like polymyopathy sat in that small, stubborn pile. Early in 2024, 2 new studies landed, this time from the National Institutes of Health, comparing more than 80 people who'd reported these incidents against a group of healthy volunteers. Detailed brain scans, a long battery of clinical tests, all of it looking for the one thing that would settle the question for good. Some physical trace, however small, that something had actually struck these people's brains. They found nothing. No difference in brain volume, no structural damage, nothing that separated the affected group from the healthy one. For some, that was the final nail in the weapon theory. For people like polymyopathy, who'd spent years living with symptoms that were unmistakably real, it landed more like an insult, a study confirming that whatever had happened to them, it apparently hadn't happened at all.
The official response wasn't an embrace. The broader conclusion held no evidence of a coordinated global campaign. Some officials said the new reporting simply didn't meet the bar needed to change the existing assessment, though parts of it would be looked at. For people like Mark Zaid, the attorney who has represented many of these officers over the years, that gap between what reporters had found and what the government was willing to say out loud wasn't an accident. He's argued publicly and repeatedly that the government has used the genuine scientific uncertainty around these cases as a kind of shield, a way of not having to confront evidence that sits behind layers of classification most people, including the victims themselves, will never get to see. So where does that leave it? What's certain is this. Starting in late 2016, dozens of people, spread across countries on opposite sides of the world, reported a strikingly consistent pattern of sudden severe symptoms, tied again and again to a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. Years of investigation by multiple agencies, scientific panels, and outside journalists have produced not one explanation but several, each backed by real evidence, and each with a hole the next theory falls straight through. Crickets explain what some people heard and nothing they felt. Stress explains some of what people felt, but not why the pattern repeated itself on the other side of the planet. Microwave weapons explain the pattern, but have never been found. And the most recent reporting points at a name, a unit, a pattern of presence, while the official assessment maintains it isn't enough. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is a man who woke up in a Moscow hotel room one night in 2017 and never quite got better. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, give it a like and tell me in the comments which detail stuck with you most. The marbles in the funnel, the crickets, or that unit number right at the end. And if you want the next one to find you the moment it's up, hitting subscribe is the easiest way to make that happen.